This week's Farm Basics is brought to you by satshot.com. Satellites aren't just for NASA anymore. Use the power of satellite imagery to create variable rate management zones in your fields. To reduce input costs and increase yields on your farm, go to satshot.com.
Why is harvest so late this year? If you're a non-farmer, you may be wondering, why are there crops still out in the fields? I like to hunt, I can't get out there and hunt. Why are these farmers waiting so long this year? We wanted to talk that through a little bit.
Opening weekend of pheasant season in South Dakota is kind of like a holiday for the state because there are so many out-of-state people coming in to shoot our state bird, the pheasant. But this year it was a big challenge. Over 90% of South Dakota's crop was still out there when it comes to corn and soybeans and sunflowers. And you know what? Those pheasants had plenty of places to hide, and the sloughs were all full of water.
Yeah, so that was mid-October. Well, now that we're talking mid-November and there are still a lot of these crops out there, everybody's going, what is the deal? Well, here's the problem. It was an exceptionally cold summer, and when we have cold weather through the summer, crops like corn that mature based on heat units. In other words, we have to have enough heat throughout the course of the summer for the corn crop to mature. There was a good percentage of South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota corn that didn't even reach maturity. That is not a good thing. Then a hard frost came along and this crop just is not drying down very well.
So what is a farmer left to do? All he can do is just wait and hope that it dries down out in the field to some degree.
Yep, and the reason why is if a farmer was to take this corn in, and let's say the corn happened to be 30% moisture.
Okay, take in where, because
right.
No grain elevator will accept 30% moisture corn.
Yeah, they'll accept 30% moisture corn.
I don't think so.
But they're really going to charge you. So just to give you an idea, if you're a non-farmer, if there was a farmer who had 30% moisture corn, in other words, 30% of every kernel was water, and he brings that into his elevator, and they do accept it, they'll charge him a lot of money to dry that crop down. Roughly, let's just say that it costs 6 cents per point, and they have to dry it from 30% moisture down to 15% moisture. So you got 15 times 6 cents, that's 90 cents a bushel. Now the other side of the thing is shrink. Let's talk about shrink. What is shrink? What does that mean? That's separate from this drying charge.
Okay, so you have this corn kernel that is full of water, and after you dry it down, you're going to have less weight than before. And for a grain elevator, which is basically a grain buying facility, when they're buying that grain, they don't want to pay you for all that water.
Well, they buy it based on weight. And when you bring in wet corn as a farmer,
you would drive your truck on a scale, they would weigh you, then you'd dump the corn off, and then you'd weigh the empty truck and see what the difference is, and that's how much weight they would pay you on. Now, if your corn is all full of excess moisture, the grain elevator doesn't want to pay for that water. In fact, it's going to cost them money to get rid of the water. So they're going to discount the amount of bushels, or basically shrink those bushels down to offset that water leaving the kernel.
So let's say that your elevator uses a percentage of 1.5% shrink for every point of moisture. In other words, if the grain is 30% moisture and the elevator has to dry it down to 15, that's 15 percentage points. So 15 times 1.5, what's that amount to? 22 and a half. So 22.5% of your corn, they basically just take away. So if it was 200 bushel corn coming in wet, on a dry basis, that amounts to, what would that be? 150, yeah, 155 bushels you'd have left. So you'd end up with only 155 bushels out of the 200 bushels you brought in, plus you've got the other 90 cents a bushel that you had to spend on the drying charge. It's a lot of money when you add it all up. As you can see, it's not a real great option for a farmer to bring 30% moisture corn into the elevator, but you know, there are some farmers, that's what they're gonna be left with. But a lot of farmers, like us for example, we're just leaving it out in the field a little longer, and then we'll dry it ourselves on our own farm, and hopefully we can do it a lot cheaper than what the elevator would charge.
And here's the big reason why it has to get dried down. For one, you just can't handle the stuff when it's that wet, but the other thing is it will not store properly over the winter. If corn isn't at least down to 15% moisture, there's no way that it's going to store even until the spring. In fact, many farmers will dry their grain down to 12 or 13% moisture so they could store it all the way through the next summer.
Yeah, and by storing, what we're talking about here is if you have wet corn, you'll get mold in it. Once it starts getting mold, it just becomes an entire moldy mess and it's shot. There are some farmers that literally have lost whole bins. They might have 10, 20,000 bushels in a bin, and it all spoils and it's all garbage. When farmers put grain in the bin, I always kind of think of it like putting money in the bank, but it's not really like that, because when I put money in the bank, I usually get that money out plus maybe a little bit. With grain, it doesn't really work that way. It could go bad.
Well, it's very similar to putting a loaf of bread in the refrigerator. If you put it in the refrigerator, you know it's going to keep a lot longer than if you left it out on the counter, but there still is kind of an end date that it's going to last. If you can put it in the freezer, or in this case with grain, if you can just dry it down and keep it cold, well, then it's not going to spoil for a really long time. You may be able to keep it for more than a year.
Well, once again, harvest is so late this year because we had a very cool summer. Now we've had a wet fall on top of that, so it's just been hard to get in the fields. The crop just isn't drying down like we'd like. It's been a really, really rough fall for a lot of farmers, but hopefully one of these days things will turn around.
Well, you know what? It has been a good fall for some things like weeds, for example. We'll show you one of the weeds that's benefited from this fall. We'll also show you how to take care of it during our Weed of the Week segment coming up later in the show.